International Version. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy hill. Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, it is close at hand.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Sabbath. This morning, oh my, must be my alarm. It must be time for the sermon. Hopefully I can shut it off. I did good to get it going. It was supposed to be louder, actually, but technical difficulties. So I'm sure we're all familiar with cell phones, and they're pretty useful little gadgets, aren't they? And I'm not the most organized person, so it comes in pretty handy to set reminders and alarms. And I also share that with you this morning because I made some notes, which I'm also not very good at either, and then I rearranged the notes a little bit ago. So if I fumble with the papers this morning, you'll understand why. But the cell phones are pretty handy, and whether you have a smartphone or a dumb phone, it alarms when you have a phone call or a text, doesn't it? But it doesn't stop there, especially with the smartphones. We get emails and various app notifications. There's, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of apps that you could have that can ding and alarm and alert you to all kinds of notifications and urgencies. It can even serve as your alarm clock or timer, as demonstrated a minute ago. At home, we have microwaves and ovens. They can tell us alarms go off to tell us, hey, time to eat, food's ready. And our refrigerator even has an alarm. Usually goes off in the middle of the night, seems like, but if the power's been off, it has this little annoying beep, 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 some sort, to let you know, I guess, that the power's been off and make sure your food didn't spoil. Or if the door's open too long, which happens frequently around our house, it'll start beeping too. And then there's the washer and the dryer, of course, to let you know when those are done and ready to go. And so the list goes on and on. Another thing that came to mind when I was making this list is smoke alarms. And so I'm not really sure why. I think it could be maybe dust builds up in there or something, but ours have gotten in the habit of going off periodically. We've changed the batteries and everything, but they still go off randomly, and it's usually in the middle of the night, maybe about 1 o'clock, or if not then, it's just when everybody's laid down and drifted off to sleep. And so for the first few times, I jumped out of bed and I'm like, oh no, we have a wood stove. So I'm thinking, oh no, where's the fire? I got to put it out, got to get everybody out. But it's happened so much that I'm no longer so concerned about the risk of fire as I am the fact of it waking everybody up in the middle of the night and then trying to get them back to sleep. And also, well, I wanted to share about that too. They're all hooked together somehow. So it's not just one, it's all of them, and they're in the bedrooms. And so, but miraculously, most of the people sleep through them in our house, so except for me. And I have experienced a similar situation at the workplace. I don't know if you guys noticed this or not, but we have fire drills periodically, especially hospital, schools, places like that. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but it goes off and they're just blaring, they're deafening, but everybody just keeps on doing what they're doing. They just keep working and whatever, maybe they're talking to somebody and so now you have to yell, but they keep talking about the same conversation. Why? Because we assume it's a drill, right? And so I don't know what'll happen if we actually have a real fire, because I think everybody would just sit there until smoke started entering the room and then say, hey, maybe this is the real thing. Maybe we better get out. And the same is true for tornado alarms. You know, they have like the week or monthly test, and we hear the siren, and we think, oh, it's a drill. So that can be true. And that made me think also of, I don't know if anybody has the NOAA weather bands, and they're on a lot of the radios now and in the tractors and things. Some of ours have that. And so I've noticed, well, we used to have a weather band, and we don't anymore. And that was by request. My wife said, we can't have that thing going off in the middle of the night because it's worse than the fire alarm. You know, you have a mock tornado siren waking everybody up. But I've also noticed in the last few years, maybe it's just me, and I know they're refining their alert system and, you know, things are getting with the radars more specific and such. But it seems like there's a lot more alarms. You know, this past spring and summer, we had a lot of thunderstorms and tornadoes, and I appreciate the warnings, but it seemed like there's a lot more of them, and I think they're getting a lot more proactive with it, a lot more the regions redefining everything. So anyway, it seems like there's more and more of those alarms, which in and of itself is good. I want to know if a tornado's coming, But kind of like we talked about the smoke alarm, they get so frequent that I'm afraid we might tend to look at it and say, oh yeah, it's another thunderstorm warning, it's another tornado warning. I don't see one outside, I think we're okay, and just dismiss it and go on. So, oh, our cars and trucks are full of alarms as well. And along with tractors, balers, combines, things like that. Our tractor has one on the seat. And so the reason it's there, the purpose of it, is so if you have the PTO on, so you're baling, mowing, whatever, and you jump out of the seat to get out, this alarm starts going off continuously to remind you to shut the PTO off so that you don't get out and get hurt, killed. But ours just goes off randomly too. So I can be driving along in the field, PTO might not even be on, and the seat's bouncing, and all of a sudden the alarm just goes off continuously, and the kids say, what's that, if they're riding with me? I say, well, it's a little hard to explain that it's an alarm that doesn't really mean anything because it's not doing what it's supposed to. And the same with the cars and trucks. There's alarms on those to prevent accidents, tell you if you're going to back into something, tell you if you're going to run into something. I have a quick story I'll share about that. My wife's grandfather, this is years ago, but I've heard the story a few times, and as I understand it, they had the backup alarms on the car, but when you back out of the garage, it detects there's walls around you and things, so it gives you a little false signal too, and it starts going beep, beep. And so I guess he's backing up, and my wife's grandmother was riding with him, so she related the story to us, and it goes beep, 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 boom. They actually run into something because this time there was something behind them. But once again, he'd heard it go off so many times that he thought, oh, there's nothing back there, even though there really was. Other alarms to tell you if you're low on gas, remind you to wear your seatbelt when you get in. If there's a mechanical malfunction, there should be lights and bells that go off. Now, our vehicles are older and they're high mileage, so our lights, for the most part, stay on all the time. And so I actually get a little concerned if they go out. I'm afraid something might be wrong. But hopefully yours aren't like that. So the purpose where I'm going with this is several of you work in the hospital setting. And if you don't work in the hospital, I know several of you have been in the hospital recently. And if not you yourself, then I'm sure probably all of us have visited someone in the hospital while they're hospitalized. And so I became aware of a term a few years back, and the term is called alarm fatigue. And I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. But what it is, if you've sat in the hospital, as I described a minute ago, everything has an alarm on it. So the medication pumps, the monitors, even the beds, if someone gets out of bed and they weren't supposed to, or if they have a chair alarm and they get up and they're at risk for a fall and they weren't supposed to, the alarm goes off. And so that's a perfect example. You're getting ahead of me. I was going to say alarms are part of our lives every day, aren't they? We're surrounded by them. So yeah, all these things in the hospital, the vital sign alarms, the ventilators, everything, like I say, that's there, it can make some sort of noise. And each one of them, of course, is supposed to be urgent when it goes off. And so they're loud and they're continuous. And so they go off. Well, what they've discovered is that there are so many alarms going off so often and probably at the same time that they've termed this phrase alarm fatigue. And what it is the nurses, they either don't hear the alarms because there's so much noise going on, maybe they don't hear one alarm over the other, or they're so numb to them, they're so desensitized because they're going off continuously all day long that if one does alert, they just really don't notice it. And so I found a few facts online to emphasize this. Research indicates that 72 to 99% of all alarms are false in the hospitals, which has led to alarm fatigue. Unfortunately, due to the high number of false alarms, alarms that are meant to alert clinicians of problems with patients are sometimes being ignored. And assuming that an alarm is false puts a patient in harm's way and could lead to medical mistakes, which they didn't say so, but even leads to death if that alarm is something that needs attention right now. So the American Association of Critical Care Nurses defines alarm fatigue as a sensory overload that occurs when clinicians are exposed to an excessive number of alarms, kind of like me in my vehicle or when the smoke alarm goes off, which can result in desensitization to alarm sounds and an increased rate of missed alarms. So a few quick facts for you. One study showed that more than 85% of all alarms in a particular unit were false. A hospital reported an average of 1 million alarms going off in a single week. A children's hospital reported 5,300 alarms in one day, and get this, 95% of them were false. A hospital reported that at least 350 alarms per patient per day, and that was in an ICU. And I'm sure there's, tons more facts and figures out there that you could look up, but the point is, there's just so many alarms, just so inundated with them, and instead of, I'm sure they do save lives, but when we're bombarded with them, then they don't really even serve their purpose. And so lives are still lost in spite of the alarms. So that got me to thinking, is alarm fatigue limited to just the medical field or to my house or automobile? And I thought of another example, you can probably think of more, is a construction site. If you've ever been to a construction site, whether it's a home being built or just, highway, working on the highway or something like that, what do you hear? My kids make their toys realistic when they back them up with this sound. Beep, beep, beep. Everything out there is beeping. And even some of the agriculture equipment nowadays beeps when it backs up. And so so what's the purpose of that? So that you know something's headed for you. If you're, that maybe the guy's driving the dump truck and he can't really see that well behind him and you're standing behind him and you don't notice, so you hear the beeping and you're like, hey, I better get out of the way. But if everything out there is beeping at the same time all day long, guess what? Alarm fatigue. And so accidents still happen in spite of the alarms. And I've even heard of people that I know of that dump trucks actually back over them and they're killed, and they say, how could that happen? And I believe it's probably due to the alarm fatigue. Probably there was alarm there. Hopefully it was working. And even so, they may just simply not have heard it or didn't recognize it. And so that got me to thinking, did alarm fatigue exist in biblical times? And I believe it possibly did. One example could be Noah. He sounded the flash flood warning to the antediluvians, didn't he? They heard that alarm for over 100 years, and guess what? They were still taken by surprise when it started ringing. The alarm went off, but they didn't heed the alarm, did they? Maybe they heard the alarm sounding at first when Noah started preaching, but over time, maybe they became desensitized to it. Lot sounded the alarm to his family in Sodom, but they choose to ignore his warning. Remember he went out and talked to him, said, hey, we need to get out of here. And, some of his immediate family went with him when the angels dragged him out, but some of his family that were married and moved out, they just said, no, we're not going. We like it here. And, sometimes we choose to ignore alarms too, don't we? Have you ever woken up in the morning, alarm's going off, perhaps on your cell phone, and you ever hit the snooze button? We ignore that alarm, don't we? Maybe that's what happened with Lot's family in Sodom. Maybe they looked around and said, maybe there's something to that, but what's the rush? We can do that later. But maybe they hit the snooze button on that alarm. Or maybe that alarm sounded by Lot was drowned out by the sights and sounds of everything going on around them in the city of Sodom. Maybe they heard him speaking to them, but they were so distracted that they really didn't hear and understand the urgency of the warning that he was giving them. So we look forward to Jesus' return, don't we? And he gave us indicators, or you could call them alarms, to remind us that that time is near. And in Matthew 24, verse 3, if you want to turn there with me to Matthew chapter 24. And we talked about some of this in Sabbath school too, in the book of Mark. We're going to look at Matthew 24 and verse 3. We're told that as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. And they said, tell us, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And as we mentioned in Sabbath school this morning, we're looking at the book of Mark. What was his answer? What were some of the signs? Remember? Wars and rumors of wars. Earthquakes, when you're deceived. Yeah, there's a whole list, and we won't look at the whole chapter, but you can definitely look at that later today and look at that again. And so I'd also like to read this quote to you related to that. It says, that time is at hand. Today, the signs of the times declare that we are standing on the threshold of great and solemn events. Everything in our world is in agitation. Before our eyes is fulfilling the Savior's prophecy of the events to precede his coming. Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. Does that sound like today at all? Does it sound like that might apply to our times today? I believe so. And to go on with the quote, the present is a time of overwhelming interest to all living. Rulers and statesmen, men who occupy positions of trust and authority, thinking men and women of all classes, have their attention fixed upon the events taking place about us. And Harvey mentioned this morning too, in Sabbath school, there's various events taking place, the different nations, the nuclear ability that some of the nations have now. There's so much going on all around us. And it says those people are watching the strained, restless relations that exist among the nations. They observe the intensity that is taking possession of every earthly element, and they recognize that something great and decisive is about to take place, that the world is on the verge of a stupendous crisis. And to go on, one last quote here, describing natural disasters. It says, disasters by sea and by land follow one another in quick succession. How frequently we hear of earthquakes and tornadoes, of destruction by fire and flood, with great loss of life and property. Apparently, these calamities are capricious outbreaks, random outbreaks of disorganized, unregulated forces of nature, wholly beyond the control of man. But in them all, God's purpose may be read. They are among the agencies by which he seeks to arouse men and women to a sense of their danger. So in other words, those could be termed as alarms, couldn't they? So those quotes, you were probably on to me there. They apply to our day 100%, but guess what? They were written over 100 years ago by Ellen White. And what we read in Scripture, the words of Jesus, he spoke those words to his disciples about 2,000 years ago, didn't he? So the skeptic could say that there's been wars going on this earth for thousands of years, ever since Jesus' time, before Jesus' time, in fact. And the same with pestilence, earthquakes, and so forth. It's nothing really new, is it? It's been going on for definitely as long as we can remember, but much longer than that. So due to that, I feel like there's a little potential for alarm fatigue. We look at those and we say, yeah, that's been going on for a long time. So what? Well, while they've been going on for a long time, they are growing in frequency and intensity. So the natural disasters, I've seen, I don't have them with me today, but you can look online, I'm sure, and I've seen statistics where earthquakes are getting more and more frequent, more and more numerous. Tornadoes, as I mentioned a while ago, even all around us during the stormy season, and even not during the storm season. We're seeing more and more violent storms. The weather's becoming more and more adverse, it seems like. And I don't think it's just our imaginations. I think it really is. I believe the effects of sin on this planet and on mankind are building and becoming more and more apparent. It's becoming more and more obvious, isn't it? So don't let the continued sounding of the alarm cause you to become desensitized to it. Jesus is coming back because, first off, he said he would, and he gave us the signs to look for, and those signs are all around us, and they're becoming more and more frequent. We're getting closer and closer to his return. So don't become desensitized to those alarms and be surprised like the people in Noah's day were. Well, Jesus also warned about false alarms. This kind of relates to the drills I mentioned a while ago. When a smoke alarm goes off and nobody moves, we hear it. We can't help but hear it, but we don't really believe it. We just assume it's a drill. There's not really a fire. Well, in the same conversation with his disciples in Matthew 24:23, and you can follow along with me if you'd like, Jesus warned against false messiahs. He says, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. Verse 24, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or, here he is in the inner rooms. Do not believe it. Verse 27, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And regarding his return, in verse 36, Matthew 24, verse 36 says, but about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day that Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. In verse 42, we read, Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. So again, he's sounding the alarm, giving us things to look for, things to think about. So how can we be ready and avoid being deceived by false alarms? By studying the scripture, for one thing. The answers are in the Bible, aren't they? And through prayer and Bible study, we can avoid being deceived by false alarms, and yet we can stay true to the true alarms. I heard something this week when I listened to a Sabbath school commentary that I found very interesting, and I wanted to share with you, and hopefully I do justice to it and it makes sense, and I believe it ties into this. And that is in Mark chapter 11, so we can turn there, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Mark chapter 11. And it describes the triumphal entry. And like I say, in our Sabbath school lesson, the adult Sabbath school quarterly this week, we studied that. And it describes how Jesus sent his disciples to go get a donkey for him to ride into Jerusalem. And it goes into great detail describing that. And the question was raised in the Sabbath school commentary that I read, why did he go into so much detail? Why does that really matter? And part of the answer was, as I understand it, that was a signal to the people. That was obvious that he was declaring himself to be king. That was how Solomon had entered into the city hundreds of years before, riding on a donkey into the city. And so they got the donkey. I'm sure you're familiar with the story. Jesus got on the donkey, they led him into town, and what did the people do? They celebrated, didn't they? They worshiped him, they praised him, they put down palm leaves, because what did they think was happening? They thought Jesus was going to be their king. And what did that mean for them? That meant freedom from oppression, didn't it? They were no longer going to be under the hand of the Romans. They were going to be a powerful nation once again, as they had been in the past, and they were excited about that. The question was raised in what I was reading and listening to, or pointed out, Jesus allowed this to happen. And if you think back, prior to this, what would he do when he healed somebody normally? He would tell that person, did he say, hey, go tell everybody what happened, show them what the blind man, show them that you can see now, things like that? Typically, he told him, don't tell anybody, just keep it quiet, let's keep this hush-hush. And there was a reason for that, but why this time did he let everybody make this big to-do, this big celebration about it? Well, I believe there was a reason for it. And the reason is the crucifixion. This was before the crucifixion. And we look at that, and it's very significant to us that Jesus died on the cross. But at that time in Rome, in that empire, the cross was an execution system, wasn't it? So similar today, like, I don't know if we use it that much now, but the electric chair or lethal injection or something like that. It was a way that they put criminals to death. And so there were possibly hundreds of crucifixions going on. Yeah, I don't know the time frame, but it was a routine thing. So as people came into the city, it wasn't unusual for them to see a crucifixion taking place, because there were criminals back then, just like there are today, and they were put to death at times. And so if Jesus hadn't allowed attention to be brought to him, it might have just been commonplace. Of course, his disciples would have noticed, some people would have noticed, but in general, it wouldn't have been a huge news-making event. But as things played out, all eyes were on Jesus because of the triumphal entry. I'm going to assume they were just waiting for him to make his move, because he was going to take over, he was going to be their next king. And the way things played out, they were watching him when the trials took place and the crucifixion took place, and it wasn't what they expected, was it? And you might say it was a big disappointment to them. They said, how could this happen? We thought he was going to be king, and now He's being executed on a criminal's cross. Well, obviously, it got the attention. It made the news, and the whole world knows about it. And so the parallel was brought out in the Sabbath school. What happened in 1844? Prophecy pointed towards Jesus coming back to earth, didn't it? And the people thought that Jesus was coming back literally and to the earth, and he was going to take them to heaven. So to back up for just a second, why were the people confused when Jesus was crucified on the cross? And I would say because they didn't fully understand the prophecies, did they? They understood that the Messiah was coming, and they got that part of it, but they didn't understand or believe what was going to happen to the Messiah when he came, that he was going to be crucified and he was going to die for our sins. The prophecies were there. They were slaying the lambs in the temple. This all pointed forward to it, so that it was there, but they didn't understand it. Well, I believe the same is true in 1844. The answers were there in Scripture, and they saw the prophecies, and they knew something was going to happen. Jesus was going to do something, but they did not understand completely what that was. And what happened was very important. It's when Jesus went into the heavenly sanctuary, and that applied to the whole world, just like the cross did too. And just like the cross made it possible for Jesus, it made it possible for Jesus to go to the sanctuary. The sacrifice had to take place in order for Jesus to go to the sanctuary and present the sacrifice to God. And so those things are connected. So the point of that is, through the great disappointment, when everybody expected Jesus to come, it went all over the world. Everybody was looking for it, even if they didn't believe it. I'm sure when they woke up that morning, they probably took a little look at the sky to see if Jesus was coming. And when you look back on history, everyone knows that there was an event that took place in 1844. In fact, coming up next month will be the anniversary of that in October. And whether they look at it and say, that's when Jesus went into the sanctuary, or they look at it and say, well, that's when the great disappointment took place. Those people thought Jesus was coming and he didn't, and they were wrong. So regardless of how you look at it, everybody knows something happened. And that also gives room for discussion. If the topic comes up and somebody says, yeah, I've heard about that, but I don't really understand it, that gives us opportunity to explain what really happened, that Jesus moved into the sanctuary. And it was also pointed out in the Sabbath school, we're to look to Jesus. So when he was on the cross, everyone looked to the cross. When he went to the sanctuary, we're to look to the sanctuary because that's where Jesus is now. And so I thought that was really, really significant and eye-opening to me. I'd never heard that aspect of it. Really kind of explained how it all fits together. And I would tie that in with the sermon to say some of those people during the Great Disappointment experienced alarm fatigue. When Jesus didn't come back like they expected him to because of the alarm that they were listening to, they fell away. Some of them turned away and they said, I don't want anything to do with any of this. Maybe religion in general, maybe they went back to the church they'd been attending and they just said, forget it. They had alarm fatigue, didn't they? They didn't hear the rest of the alarm or the continuation of it. But others, what did they do? They studied the scriptures. They said, there's something here we're missing. There's something here we don't understand. And so they studied the scriptures more. And that led to them understanding the whole thing of the sanctuary. And that's a whole sermon in itself. I'm not covering all that this morning. But go study it for yourself, and like they did, and see. And as a result of that, that resulted in the formation eventually of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so my takeaway from that is we need to study the scriptures, don't we, for ourselves. And when we think of alarms, I would encourage you to listen to the alarms from God. Alarms are important. They exist for a reason, like we mentioned a while ago, whether it's to wake us up in the morning, whether it's to let us know that a patient needs attention, there's a dump truck headed our way, there's a fire in our house, whatever it might be. They do exist for a reason. And the same with the scriptural alarms. So listen to those alarms from God. Don't hit the snooze button on them. And try to limit the alarms that we're bombarded with every day that distract us and make it harder to hear God's alarms, because we are surrounded with the cell phones, the news bulletins, the weather alerts, things like that. Don't let those drown out the true alarms from God. And pray that God will help you not to become desensitized to his alarms. And, as I mentioned a second ago, study the scriptures and avoid alarm fatigue.